Professor Juel Nielsen, would you describe for us how your study of identical twins reared apart began?
Yes. It started back in 1954, and it started in the way that at that time I was working as a young psychiatrist in an outpatient department, and there I had a patient, a female of 54, and she had a psychiatric history, of course, and then she told me during that interview that she was actually a twin, but she didn't know her twin sister very well because they had been separated at the age of 3 weeks, something like that. They had very little contact, and but from what she told me, I could I had the impression that they were monozygotic twins, which they showed up to be later. And then I was familiar with the study done in your country by Newman, Freeman, and Holzinger, and then I decided it might be interesting to study this case more carefully. We got into contact with a twin sister, a psychologist and I, and then we sat down and discussed what we could do about it, and we just decided that we would try to investigate them as thoroughly as possible and look for differences and similarities, and we had to use the tool available, psychological testing we were using in the clinic, and interviewing, which and then of course the medical examinations. And then a few weeks later, a newspaperman, a journalist, approached me. He heard about my interest in such studies, and then he reported a case where a woman had approached another woman in the street, and she had asked this second woman, "Do you have a sister living in this particular town?" And she said, No, I have no sisters. I was adopted. I was placed in adoptive home." But then it turned out that they were twins, monozygotic twins brought up apart. So we had 2 cases at hand, and we waited for a long time before the 3rd case appeared. We felt we should have 3 cases.
Rounded out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, it really lasted 10 years to collect the 12 cases I've been studying, and that only came about because in the meantime I found out that a Danish twin register was available, a register of all twins born in Denmark from 1880 to 1920, and I went through all these cases. I think there were about 7,000 or 8,000 same-sex pairs. I found about 50 pairs who were likely to be monozygotic twins, brought up apart from early childhood, and alive and available for investigation. But we came down to 12 cases.
You know, when we began our study and we worked with our first set of twins, I think we had the same orientation. Our idea was to look for differences because clearly they would be environmental, and from the point of view of a psychologist, that's sort of the most interesting feature of this kind of a study. But we were absolutely amazed at the degree of similarity in our first pair. I think that's really what grabbed us. It was quite astounding. What was your first pair like?
Well, we're very much alike, and So it was in the beginning that we were very impressed by the similarities because they were so striking and unexpected. Later on, of course, we looked for differences, but that's, as you know very well, the difficult thing. What is a difference?
Where are they, and what is a difference?
Yes.
Yeah, the
And
definition.
what is a similarity? And can you measure a difference between two people?
Yeah, the problems of the reliability of measurement
Right.
and the level of analysis and the meaning of what you're seeing.
That's really
they're
the
difficult.
problem.
We've discussed a few points, and I recall reading in your book a comment that you never came to any general solution to the nature-nurture problem. And that led me to think that while you might not have come to a general solution, you may have some very specific ideas about the interaction of nature and nurture. Could you comment on that?
Well, that general solution, that general conclusion, I really quoted Newman and co-workers, and they said something like that such studies will probably never give general conclusions because they'll raise more questions and answers. It may not be true, but in my case, I mean, I was working with only 12 cases, so beforehand it was not very likely that we could arrive at general conclusions, but still I think the study of a single case is valuable, very valuable, because you're faced with data and you have to explain them, and very often you end with data that are so similar that the only explanation left is that you must assume that some genetic factors are in action, or have been in action.
My colleague, Professor Licken, has discussed this in a couple of contexts, and he's moving toward the conclusion that perhaps Gordon Allport was right, that personality is highly idiographic. We find a set of twins will be remarkably similar in many domains: interests, personality, perhaps some modest psychiatric symptoms, very similar ability patterns, yet they'll be dramatically different from every other twin we've looked at. And so you see a highly unique structure replicated in each twin.
Yes, that's perhaps when we talk about heredity, we tend to talk about something running in the families and something you can discover among siblings or parents. But perhaps if you look at one person, he's unique, and except for monozygotic twins, every human being is unique in his genotype. So you might have a certain constellation which is unique, but it will also be unique for this particular twin pair. And you may not be able to find certain characteristics among the siblings or among other people.
Yeah.
So you're left with a problem that it's very difficult to find these cases. But, well, up to now, including your study, there will be more than 100 cases in the literature, cases of monozygotic. And you cannot continue to ignore these reports because they challenge you. You have to take an attitude sooner or later. But as you stressed, it's a question of measuring, and our methods are the problem here.
Yeah,
because the twin